Tēnā koutou katoa. It's great to be back. Great to see you all this morning. As many of you will be aware, there's a few of us disappeared last weekend. Big family occasion. Shah's grandma's 85th birthday. So that was a good time had. But have you ever been on a long trip with a 1-year-old? Yeah. That was. Have you read my notes? Yeah, so a good trip, a long trip. We traveled all the way back last Sunday, left at 8 in the morning. I sat in the back, I watched the rugby on my phone. Well, we won't talk any more about that, I promise. And we arrived back 13 hours later here at 9:20 at night. So a good journey, a good reason for the trip. The trip, something I'm not as fond of, but it was a good occasion. So, have you ever been on a long journey where someone says, "Are we nearly there yet?" Or what's the other thing people say? "We should have gone that way. Why did no one listen to me? We'd be there by now." Well, as we continue through Acts, we're almost at the end, and what we're going to see today is one of the most dramatic scenes across probably all of Scripture, as Paul finally makes the journey to Italy by boat from Israel. He's been under house arrest in Caesarea for 2 years. And this is a long and treacherous journey by boat across the Mediterranean Sea. And as we read of this storm, we're going to have an opportunity to reflect on the storms that we all face in our own lives from time to time and see how what we're reading today can speak into some of the most difficult periods that we ourselves face. So that's our journey this morning. Now, we've been saying all year how skilled a writer Luke is. And he's written this book, the Gospel of Luke, Acts, the two parts of this one book, spanning 52 chapters, one of the most important works in the New Testament. And yet, it might surprise you to think that at no point in those 52 chapters does Luke say, "Hey, about the cross, this is what the cross of Jesus means." Instead, what Luke does is he weaves the meaning of the cross into the stories that he writes, that he tells. Now, we've also seen recently that there's parallels between the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus makes his final journey toward Jerusalem, and we've seen Paul make his final journey toward Jerusalem. Well, Bishop N.T. Wright suggests that these parallels continue. Jesus goes into Jerusalem, and then he faces his trial, and then obviously the crucifixion. Well, we've already seen Paul's trials begin, which means what we're going to see today is kind of, in some ways, the equivalent, the narrative equivalent for Luke of the crucifixion. What we're going to see today tells us something of what Luke understands about Jesus' death. Now, we've got to be clear. What Luke isn't saying is that Paul is like another Jesus. That's not the point. The point is that the gospel, the good news of God and his kingdom, is the focus and what happens to God's good news. Paul is merely the vehicle which Luke is focusing on, that the gospel is traveling with. So with those things in mind, we're going to start reading Acts 27, verse 1. I invite you to turn with me, but it will also be up on the screen. When the time came, we set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. Okay, we're seeing those words again, we and us. What have they been telling us throughout the book of Acts, every time we've seen them? Who does that tell us is with Paul at this point? Luke, yeah, the author, is part of the travel at this point again. In fact, it's possible he's been with Paul in Caesarea, starting to write down Paul's accounts for the book of Acts. So Luke is one of Paul's companions for this trip. We continue. We left on a ship whose home port was Adramyttium on the northwest coast of the province of Asia. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. The next day, when we docked at Sidon, Julius was very kind to Paul and let him go ashore to visit friends so they could provide for his needs. Putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So we sailed north of Cyprus between the island and the mainland. And keeping to the open sea, we passed along the coast of Sicilia and Pamphylia, landing at Myra in the province of Lycia. So on this journey, Paul once again finds good standing with the Romans, because there's just something about Paul, or perhaps we should say something about God with Paul, which means people are treating him better than his status as prisoner deserves. They probably also know that he's not considered guilty of the crimes he is accused of. And at this point, they need to locate a new ship to take them across the Mediterranean Sea to Italy, which they do find, and they set sail. This is going to be a big boat. There's nearly 300 people on this boat. So we read on in verse 6. There the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria bound for Italy, and he put us on board. We had several days of slow sailing, and after great difficulty, we finally neared Cnidus. But the wind was against us, so we sailed across to Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island past the Cape of Salmone. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. We had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall, and Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. So here we are, we're in kind of October in the Northern Hemisphere. We're in autumn, a time where the weather starts to get more unpredictable and more dangerous. Now, this is a time of year where ships and their crews would start to knuckle down for winter, camp out where they are for a few months, and wait for the new spring and the new year to resume their travels. And we've already read how difficult the journey has been, how slow it has been. Paul is also a seasoned traveler by boat. He wrote to the letter of 2 Corinthians before this trip. And in chapter 11, he writes, 3 times I was shipwrecked, and I spent a day and a night in the open sea. So Paul knows about the dangers of sea travels. He knows the difficulties that might lie ahead if they choose to go on, and that's why he's speaking up to those in authority. And then he speaks up. Men, he said, I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well. But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. And maybe fair enough, you might think. And since Fair Havens was an exposed harbour, or poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wondered why it was called Fair Haven after all, and wanted to go on to Phoenix, farther up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbour with only a southwest and a northwest exposure. So if we could put up a map on the screen, we'll see something of this journey that we're on. Now, the island of Crete is right there in the middle. So we've made the journey across from the east, from Israel, across to Crete. And there's Fair Haven, which isn't such a fair haven, it turns out, right in the middle. They just want to nip up the coast to the place of Phoenix. Relatively short journey, and much better place to spend the winter. So that's the plan that the ship's crew comes up with. That red arrow might tell you that's not what happened. So that's what we're going to see as we continue in verse 13. When a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought they could make it. So they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength, called a northeaster, burst across the island and blew us out to sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. We sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Corda, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard the lifeboat being towed behind us. Then the sailors bound ropes around the hull of the ship to strengthen it. They were afraid of being driven across to the sandbars of Syrtis off the African coast. So they lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. The next day, as gale-force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard. The following day, they even threw some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. And the terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars, until at last all hope was gone. This is like one of those great sea epics. Those trips talked about that seem to take forever, 13 hours from Foxton to Whangarei. Well, this is on another level. Day after day of this storm. So we just want to try and experience a brief bit of what that might have been. So we're going to play a short clip of a storm. We're going to dim the lights a bit and just kind of imagine being in this, not for a few seconds, but for 2 weeks. Imagine how this must have felt. Day after day after day. This is surely one of the extremes of human experience. And not only the sound, the light, the dark, the lightning, it's the wind blowing through, soaking you to the core, blowing water over you. The crew has no idea where they are because they can't see the stars. And hope is gone. And we learn later on in this passage that people stop eating because they're so dejected. Now, this is probably a good point as well to dig into the attitude the Jews generally had toward the sea. Now, Paul was very unusual. As a Jew, he did a lot of travel by sea because generally the Jews kept to the land. And a scan across the Old Testament shows some of the attitudes that the Jews had toward the sea. It was seen as a destructive and chaotic power only God had the power to subdue. In Psalm 89 it says, "You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them." The sea was also considered the home of the enemy of evil and death. There's this great mythical sea creature called the Leviathan, and this was kind of a personification of the evil. We read about it in many places, such as Psalm 74. "You, O God, are my king from ages past, bringing salvation to the earth. You split the sea by your strength and smashed the heads of the sea monsters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan and let the desert animals eat him." And finally, the Jews also saw the sea as a tool of judgment against sin. Think of Jonah trying to run away, or the Israelites crossing the Red Sea to escape from the Egyptians, and then the sea washing over Pharaoh and his army. So again, if we think about the parallels between Luke's gospel, Jesus' trials, the torment, the judgment of the cross. Well, here in Acts, it's the trial, it's the judgment of the sea through Paul and then onto the gospel. But Jesus overcame the cross and was resurrected, and what we're going to see is that similar narrative concept. We're going to get to the turning point. All hope seems gone, but we get to verse 21, and where we get that little light of hope shining in the darkness. No one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, "Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all this damage and loss." And we go, "Don't be that guy, Paul. That's not helpful." A writer I read last week said, there's a reason when Paul gave the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, there's a reason he didn't write tact, because he didn't have any. But as we go on, we see the reason that Paul's speaking isn't so he can tell them, "I told you so." It's because he's speaking hope, as we see as we go on. But take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night an angel of the Lord, to whom I belong and who I serve, stood beside me. And he said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul. You will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island.'" And Paul shares this prophecy of hope with the crew. Paul knows that the trial, the judgment of their chaotic seas is going to be overcome. The gospel will endure the judgment of the water, and the gospel will prosper. Onto the shipwreck in verse 27. About midnight on the 14th night of the storm, the 14th night, as we were being driven across the Sea of Adria, the sailors sensed land was near. They dropped a weighted line and found the water was 120 feet deep. But a little later they measured again and found it was only 90 feet deep. At this rate, they were afraid we would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, "You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. Now, it wasn't unheard of in ancient times for the ship's crew to abandon everyone on board and leave them to their fate. And this is where Paul brings his influence with the Romans to bear. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. "You've been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks," he said. "Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair of your heads will perish." Then he took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all, and broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat, all 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. When morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. So they cut off the anchors and left them in the sea. They lowered the rudders, raised the foresail, and headed toward shore. But they hit a shoal and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship stuck fast, while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the force of the waves and began to break apart. The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out his plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land, and the others held onto planks or debris from the broken ship. So everyone escaped safely to shore. We might ask there, why come all this way only to then kill the prisoners at the last moment? Well, this is the brutality of the Roman Empire. If you were a soldier tasked with looking over a prisoner and they escaped in a shipwreck, well, that was the death sentence was then going to be put on you for allowing them to escape. So the soldiers don't want to face this possibility from happening. But again, Julius, the Roman commander, he's looking out for Paul, and so that doesn't happen. Now, you might think we've come through all of that, but actually we're not done, and there's one more trial that Paul has to face after landfall is made on the island of Malta. This is at Acts 28. Once we were safe on shore, we learned that we were on the island of Malta. The people of the island were very kind to us. It was cold and rainy, so they built a fire on the shore to welcome us. As Paul gathered an armful of sticks and was laying them on a fire, a poisonous snake, driven out by the heat, bit him on the hand. Imagine escaping a shipwreck, only to be bitten by a snake. The people of the island saw it hanging from his hand and said to each other, "A murderer, no doubt." Though he escaped the sea, justice will not permit him to live. But Paul shook off the snake into the fire and was unharmed. The people waited for him to swell up or suddenly drop dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw he wasn't harmed, they changed their minds and decided he was a god. So snakes, that classic symbol of evil, one more judgment cast against the gospel in Paul. But Paul again survives and begins to minister to the islanders in verse 7. Near the shore where we landed was an estate belonging to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us and treated us kindly for 3 days. As it happened, Publius's father was ill with fever and dysentery. Paul went in and prayed for him, and laying his hands on him, he healed him. Then all the other sick people on the island came and were healed. And as a result, we were showered with honors. And when the time came to sail, people supplied us with everything we would need for the trip. And this is the trip which eventually leads to Rome, which we'll encounter next week. But we've had this whole dramatic journey, dramatic sailing, a storm, a shipwreck, a snake bite, and 276 people journey safely to shore. How was your week, Paul? Well, we're going to leave this passage here today, but in Luke's presentation of the gospel and of Acts, the message is evil cannot stop the gospel. Evil cannot stop the kingdom of God. Jesus passed through both judgment and death to be resurrected for us all. The waters, the snake threw everything they had at the gospel through Paul, and the gospel endured and continued to transform lives on the other side. That's the gospel. It's the good news of hope, and evil cannot stop it. But then we've got to acknowledge that although God's kingdom is present with us on earth today, it's not yet in its final form. We know the storms of life come. We could do a quick survey of this room, and I'm sure we'd draw up quite the list of storms we've either faced or will face or are facing at the moment. Addiction, homelessness, miscarriages, bereavement, broken relationships with loved ones, bullying, trauma, financial hardship. In these storms, it can feel like we're being swept along against our will with no end in sight. And like Luke wrote, it might seem in those times that there is no hope, only darkness. So maybe the message for us here this morning is that in these times, God's goodness will prevail. Yeah, things might never be as we want them or as God wants them in this life, but the Christian hope is also in the fullness of the life to come. This is what the book of Hebrews says in chapter 6, reading from verse 18. Therefore, we who have fled to God for refuge can have great confidence as we hold to the hope that lies before us. This hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. We've read a lot about anchors this morning. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary. Jesus has already gone in there for us. He has become our eternal high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the storms of life will come. We know this, we've experienced it, and we know that they will come again. The question for us is, how do we respond when they do? Can we run away from discouragement and apathy into God? Yeah, experiencing grief and sadness, that's a natural part of life. But in those times, we can choose despair, or we can choose the hope that can anchor our souls. Hope based on Jesus as our high priest and our king, who is in God's presence, constantly interceding, praying to God on our behalf. The storms of life will come, but how will we respond when they do? So as we contemplate all that, we're going to move into a time of reflection. Now, in this time, we're going to have some cards available at the front. I just need to grab them from the side. They're going to look like this. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. So if it's helpful to you, you might be going through a storm at the moment or know someone who is, I invite you to come forward and take a card to use as a reminder that God is a God of hope and a God of life. the God of hope that we can run toward. If you're not currently going through a storm, we know that they come along. Perhaps you want to take one as a reminder for yourself in such times. We've also got to acknowledge that it's important in the storms of life to seek the assistance and the help of others, doctors, friends, counselors, and so on, because the hope of the gospel through the Spirit can speak through these people as well. So the music team's going to lead us through the song Still. Use this time as you need to. Come to the front and take a card. Talk, share, and pray with the people around you. And I'd like to leave you with this thought. Perhaps the most profound thing about the anchor as a symbol of hope is that the rougher the weather, the more important the anchor becomes for stability and safety. God bless you, Father.